Good afternoon, and a very warm welcome to all our viewers and listeners to this first in our season of Critical Thinking Live, where I have the pleasure to once again, it's almost become an annual event, where I have a conversation with someone really significant who understands economics, politics, and has been doing a lot of analysis over the years. And that's Sven, who is the chair of McKinsey Global Institute and also a senior partner at McKinsey. And so I have a pleasure to kind of speak to him about what he thinks, or what does McKinsey think about the economic outlook for Europe and others. But for a moment, as we welcome you back into this 2024 year, I just want to say thank you for joining us. I hope you all had a fabulous, peaceful and restful year. 23 was quite a helter-skelter, as you all know this. We had such surprises, such tragedies, as well as we saw the world at war in different ways. And as we close the year off, the Red Sea seemed to be igniting itself, given the overspill from what's happening in the destruction of Gaza. As we enter 2024, we are looking at a world at vote. So nearly half the world's population is going to be voting all across the world. And it's likely that, will we get, shall we not name his name like Voldemort, Trump back in power? What will happen to the world if we do? All of us are wondering. None of us want to think about it, but we have to think about it. What does that say about America and world relations? So as we think about politics, we need to think about economics. And that's why it gives me the greatest pleasure to have Sven with me. McKinsey have just released a report, and we highly recommend it. It's called Accelerating Europe's Competitiveness for a New Era. So Accelerating Europe, Competitors for a New Era. Sven, thank you for joining me. It's a great pleasure. I think we should definitely make this an annual event with you and I. Share with us, our listeners and viewers, as we're coming up to the end, it's end of January. It's 29th of January. What should they be thinking about? What's the bottom line for Europe that your report shines a light on?
Thank you, and it's great to be with the Friends of Europe again. I think we're just all friends of Europe, and that's why we care, and that's why we have this conversation, and that's also why we do the analysis. Why do we care about Europe? There's many good things in Europe. We are happier to start with. We actually have somewhat higher trust in government than the US has. We are probably further down the road in sustainability and so on, with its challenges. And we are probably, if you just take Gini or other metrics, a somewhat more inclusive society if you take the comparisons with the United States into account. So this beautiful Europe that we all love, with its food, taste, cities, history, and so on, we would like to keep. And the question is, can Europe do that with its level of competitiveness that it's having right now? Many pundits said, Europe kind of grows 1 point slower than the US always. How long can you sustain that? And just to start with a few numbers, that was also a version of that in an earlier report. In Europe, the average company basically is expected to grow 1 point slower than the United States. The average company is smaller. The average company has smaller market capitalization. The average company larger companies spend half of the R&D, and the average company has a return on invested capital that's 300-400 basis points lower, which means that the returns for investment in Europe in businesses are inferior to those in the US. Mm-hmm. If that means what I see in many boardrooms that I'm in, that the boardrooms basically, when they need to decide marginally, do I put my money here or there, mm-hmm. and they lean to the US or they lean to growth markets in the East, net, the investment and the capital deepening of Europe will slow. And with that, it might over time threaten our ability to, have our cake and eat it, the beautiful sustainability, inclusion, and happiness and trust, which comes from the smaller communities. And so this report builds on an earlier report where we looked at this only through the technology businesses lens. This is now all business and all sectors, where you see similar patterns, but we come also with different suggestions of where to go from here.
So what does that mean for, let's say, imagine we've got people listening to you, citizens of Europe. What's the message to them if we don't get this right? So how will it directly impact them?
At the end of the day, how this impacts citizens of Europe is that they will have less wealth, They will have less access to certain kinds of jobs that come with the large global platform businesses, not just the tech ones, but also science-based platforms and so on. And they run the risk that their children will not have the same beauty of Europe that we have experienced now for a time, because you can't sort of keep eating at the competitiveness of Europe and believe that you can still have a prosperous Europe. Let's take the industrial sector.
Right.
The industrial sector is currently facing Europe with much higher energy prices, and those energy prices make it much less competitive. We saw a nice reduction in Germany last year on carbon, but the reason was not more efficiency or better climate technology implementation. The reason was a cut in industrial output. Right. And the idea that you can have a region like Europe without a significant industrial base, significant technology and science-based business base, is just factually incorrect. We can't be the bank of the world, but with no other sectors in the same thing, also agriculture and so on. So the big risk for citizens is, if this keeps going for too long, that net the capital will be going to different places where the returns are better, and maybe the regulation is somewhat easier, and so we can come to that. Mm-hmm. And net Europe on a very slow scale will peter out a little bit, and with that, I think you risk the things we all love.
Okay, let's come back to the role of the Commission in this kind of state of affairs we find ourselves in, as a regulator, as a body that can create conditions for growth in different ways. But let's come back to that in a moment. I want to go back to this point that you were making about the report and how it's received by key players. Earlier in the year, you presented this to Davos. And what was the reception there? Because you had the global elite there, listening to what McKinsey had to say about the economic outlook. But how was it received?
So I think the concern about European competitiveness is long lingering among executives and leaders in Europe, from politicians to business executives. We've been hosting in different places, not just Davos, over the last years, discussion groups on European competitiveness, whether that's with the EU, whether that's with businesses, with local communities in a particular country. And the concern is very profound. And when you have the people sit together, they really radiate that if we don't turn this now, and there's real level of urgency with it, the risk might just become disproportional. And one of the discussions that we had, which is also in our report, is to not just say, do the analysis that we're sliding on competitiveness, but also give some suggestions on what need to happen. Some of them are very common goals, but many people in Europe, I think Friends of Europe, yourselves as well as the EU, say we should get to 2 times the corporate R&D. Yeah. And you can't say you can't mandate R&D because you can't mandate to spend. So you'll have to find another mechanism by which this is done. In the US, this is largely done through the defense sector and many other sectors. This now could happen in Europe too. Similarly, Europe, if it wants to maintain its industrial base and some of these sectors, will have to almost have its own supply chain organized. What we did during the vaccine crisis, it was probably America first, Europe second. But we actually got organized at the European scale to get the supply of vaccines organized. But we will have to do this with lithium. We'll have to do this with solar panels. And on that, the scale of Europe would probably help. We also think that the energy price in Europe is currently so high, in particular power, that I think we should set ourselves a goal that price drops by a factor 2 to 3, which is painful because people say that price is actually giving the incentive to climate action and so on. But you can't not have an industry, because then you can't. Similarly, we say that the fragmentation in Europe is currently such that you basically have the smaller companies that with their size are not competitive. Partially that is because of the M&A rules that not only measure European scale, but they also measure local scale. Yeah. And as a result, we have more telcos in a single country in Europe than we have in the total of the US as an example industry, but you could go to many more. And I think these things are pragmatic. We even went so far that if it's hard to get an easy structure to do this inside the current base, should we create a 28 district country or something like that, where everybody can opt into standardized, harmonized regulation and tools and so on? Because the 4 principles of the EU have been beautiful, but they're not finished. They're not finished on the banking side. They're not finished on the product side. They're not finished on all kinds of licensing sides.
Mm-hmm.
The one thing that does come through also is that the speed of regulation in Europe is just slower.
Indeed.
And that's approval things. It's not that we don't get the approvals, but there's a speed and a regulatory detail that's just different. And we, in another report, talked about how that affects the discussion between the climate regulation in Europe, which is a mandated date to produce a product differently, versus the IRA, which is a subsidy to innovate. That last bit just works better.
Indeed. I mean, we've known for a long time, haven't we, that when you think about what Japan does, China and US in terms of R&D, the percentages are triple to that of the EU. And we've known this for a long time, and commissioners surely have known this for a long time, and the council. But something doesn't shift in their thinking. They don't seem to think it's worth the effort to a certain extent. And that's why, can I ask you just to focus a little bit on this lovely idea of a 28th state, which is almost about an economic industrial base for Europe. Expand on that a little bit, would you, in terms of how that works?
So take one step back to your point on, it's not sure, I totally agree with you that the Commission knows, and that the EU civil servants know what the situation is. The goals are written.
Yeah.
Where does it break? The first point is the EU has no money compared to the federal budgets of either Japan, China, or the US.
Sure.
So the only policy instrument is one of regulation, mandating or tightening regulation. The mindset around that regulation, or the construct of that regulation, is probably one of protect. So, for example, the telecom industry, this led to a deflationary telecom industry, which is good for consumers in the first order. But if you then don't have a healthy telecom industry, which only makes 4% return on capital, at some point you will not get the telecom investment that you need. And so I think we need to reset to some degree the discussion on where the money will come from, because it is actually about money. And 1 or 2% of the R&D in the US is defense. 1 or 2% is science-based programs in pharma and health, and they do add up to something which you might call an industrial policy, for which, of course, the toolbox of the EU is insufficient. And the problem is, if you have a toolbox at EU level that is regulatory mandates, you just get with a little bit of a bias to safety rather than to expansion. You just get something that just keeps biting, and you kind of have to get at a breakthrough in this area would be needed. Now the question is, could that be in the 28th district? Could the 28th district have an R&D fund? Could the 28th district create common defense products? Could the 28th district have a bank that everybody in Europe can bank at, but you don't need to write 27 APIs for the other countries?
Precisely.
And so the idea was, could there be a space in which innovation can occur with standardization, where every European citizen is also citizen? So in a way, you solve it that way. It will have all the problems of that. How competitive will that district be versus the other 27? But it's also trying to illustrate we got to be quite creative to break through this logjam.
Indeed. But my only when you say that the EU doesn't have money, it has the largest R&D fund in the world almost, actually competes in the top 5, Horizon program. You've got all the money that's coming out as funding, if you like. The RFF, the biggest capital experiment the EU has ever done. So actually, when you think about it in terms of the funding streams available to it, if it were to think differently and pool all of that money, this 28th state could be quite a lovely idea.
It could be a big one. Could be a big one. Yes, could be a big one.
Exactly.
If you add the ETFs and so on, that funding. So I think it could be a pretty big district or state or whatever you want to call it. But I think all these are illustrations that it needs a click that really creates a logjam. Now, then you can't expect, if you have a state with that money or the money that's currently flowing, which is way more than 3 years ago even, also in response to IRA and so on, that then all of a sudden business will just go in there. But do not underestimate the impact of the fact that the businesses have 300-400 basis points less return. So you got to find a way that a path to higher returns creates the incentives for local investment also by the business. Otherwise, they will still go, with whatever they invent in Europe. They will go to the US first because it's more profitable.
Precisely.
And to me, there we need to find a way in, call it, in the dialogue between public and private, that higher margins for businesses are not viewed nor executed as a next level of extraction of margin, but as the incentive to create investment. And so there has to be a little bit of a handshake and an understanding. In one of the conversations that you were in also, we saw it clearly that people start to understand, you can regulate something tighter and tighter, but if it doesn't make money over time, it dies. And that breakthrough we need.
Indeed. Let's turn to that. Let's turn to public-private partnership in a moment. But I want to take our attention now. So going from the heady notion, this magical, lovely, beautiful idea of a 20th state, and think at the other side, the supply side of talent. In your report, again, we recommend people actually read it because it is really very interesting and thoughtful and provocative about what we might do. But when you think of the supply side of talent, because you talk about universities partnering with the private sector, but at the supply end, I'm talking about primary and secondary education. Nearly 50% of teachers are 50 and 50 plus. What we know from the data is it's really difficult to bring in new talent. Teachers are staying here for less than 2 years. The actual pay structure is really poor. And the ability to keep people for over more than 2 years is almost nil. And we know that COVID shook up the ground and infrastructure for education. Now, we are promoting that you need to have a reimagination of the future of education, both digital, but also think differently about how you cost it, how you pay for it, because actually it pays off in terms of potential economic growth. We don't seem to get that when we think about the actual salaries in the teaching establishments. Give us your sense of how do we square the circle with your notion of, having better talent in Europe. And industry has always been complaining for the past 20 years, they just don't have the talent. Here is the answer: foreign talent.
So I think it's the supply side and then it's the education side. One thing that we had in an earlier report, we compared whether the best of almost anything, whether it's education or healthcare or something, exists in Europe. It actually does. The best education in the world exists in Europe. Some people would argue it sits in Finland. Some might say it's somewhere else, or it sits in a particular school somewhere in the UK or in Italy. Let's just be clear. But the best practice does exist in Europe. What Europe is not so good at is to say, okay, why don't we then scale that best practice, which, by the way, included paying teachers more, so there's higher incentive for the teachers to be there and so on. So to me, one thing is, how can the best practice just advance again? The second part is, if you don't have enough demand for the new skills, you also have an issue on the supply side, because I think on this talent, I'm sometimes torn between the demand and supply. It's basically, if we have the AI winners in Europe, and on some of them, we might even have some that start to be in the game, which is great, then we might get the best AI talent. Then get AI talent at scale and so on. But if you don't have that top layer, that talent will decide even to go somewhere else. The very best physics students, the very best computer science students. And to me, that's another reason why European competitiveness is so important. Because if you have the leading companies, people will get inspired to choose the right tracks. In my country, a company called ASML that does spectacular things in semiconductors. That is a major buildup of semiconductor talent in the world, just because that company is successful at global scale. And we have other ones like that, but not enough. And to me, that's why I think we talk about European competitiveness as the driver. Because one of the problems that you might have is when you sit in a ministry or you sit in one of the the directorates of the EU, you might think a lot about supply, but if the company doesn't exist that is pulling, that supply might not superfluous, but that's an issue. So I think we need to work both sides.
So I spoke about a smarter thinking approach to the education provision structure, and actually think both in terms of a market approach, but also think about what will attract people to get into education in the first place and see a pathway and an outcome for them. So, that's a very interesting idea too, also. But, and it'll be interesting to see whether, this leads me into the conversation about public-private partnerships. It also takes both to tango and come together. What I mean by that is public and private. And as you said, you and I have both been in conversations where the private sector has said, well, if only they'd brought us in earlier, or if only they'd listened to us in terms of what kind of structure we should put into a PPI, as they call it. So can you say a little bit about what your thinking is? Because you speak about in the report that we need a different kind of relationship between the public and private sector. Now, from our perspective, what we are saying as a think tank is that you need to have a better deal making upstream, rather than the EU simply saying, we have got these major projects, we're going to procure them, and here you go. And there's no sense of the relationship between public sector money, finance, its role, and that in the private sector. What's your thinking on that?
I think, and whether it's perfect or not, I don't think so. But in the US, there's more dynamic where the business sector proposes, if you do this, you're going to get this. So it's the people that need to execute, do the design. Significant chunks of the IRA were designed that way. And as a result, you know that if you do it, the commitment is almost mutual already. And that's on, but versus, you put a regulation in and hope they will do it.
Yeah.
And when they start doing it. And so what you called out in deal making is a little bit like that. It's like some of these problems, whether it's the energy transition or something, are so enormously complex. The idea that you can just sit somewhere and put a regulation in and then it will just solve. While there's enormous, not in my backyard problems and all that kind of stuff that all need to come together to make it happen. I think that's where the biggest collaboration needs to actually be what you call upstream. And then there's of course some big policies like the M&A markets. At the end of the day, there the politicians need to decide, are they okay that we end up with 5 big players or 6 big players in Europe rather than 100 in certain sectors? That has many political dimensions. That
of course
is why we are where we are. One executive had a good remark. Is like, Europe is of course a special experiment because it came together organically. And not by force. And no, that might take a few more generations. But the real problem in this report suggests that we can't have no speed.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well said. And it goes back to the point you were making. We'll come back to towards the end. We've got we've got a little bit of time. But the issue for me is what you spoke about. During COVID, we saw agility, speed, and intervention in a different way that we ever imagined. But that was to do with adversity. Well, we need to bottle that up and make sure that becomes the norm of the day. But I want to go to public debt now for a second, if I may. Again, in your report, there's a lot of remarks there about what can happen by public sector behaving in a certain way, regulating differently, as we just said, partnering differently with the private sector. But Sven, the reality is, public PLC is broke. It's the highest debt any public authority has had since the records began. We know some municipalities, some of the largest, are going bust. If I take the UK as an example, the second city of England has gone bust, bankrupt. Birmingham City Council with millions of people that they serve, but there's been 6 others. That's only the tip of the iceberg, or the tip of the kind of let's say the momentum that might hit the continent of Europe too. What's your take on how do we square again some of the assessment you make and recommendations you make with the fact that public debt's the highest it's ever been?
Yeah, so I think it's a very good question. It probably implies that the money can't just be a big check from the public sector to the private sector, which means that even more country by country and at the EU level, you need to unleash the private sector, because that's the source of investment that they are not that leveraged as the average public, and the real problem is that we had a real slowdown on capital deepening since the financial crisis in Europe, and we are behind on the level of investment. So the only chance that you have is to get significant investment going that can create productivity, to create innovation, and so on. Is that to maximize the incentives for the private sector to do that, including reducing the complexity of regulation and getting things done, I think the EU can do many things, but. If the money is running out to some degree, which I can understand the way you say it, you probably have to get it from the source that has if it has incentives. But for that, it can't be that you have an entire sector that has 4% return on capital, and not allow the solution that's obvious to bring it to 8, which would then promote, which then promotes investment. And we got to start looking at it that way, because if significant sectors way below cost of capital will just mean that Europe will disinvest.
Let's turn to on that point, because given the public debt, I think is also related to what we're going to do with the population and the reflection of the population in Europe. We have a demographic challenge, as you know. We've got a lot of old people living longer, a pension, a hole in the pension system in Europe, as with elsewhere, and young people not being able to buy their first property like the way you and I, our generation, was able to. Let's put it that way. Yep. Again, say comment on that in terms of what needs to happen.
There's a bit of a personal remark that I will make also. So we have to stop telling the kids that there's some practical things at US, housing, whatever, but we can't have an apocalyptic view of the future.
Yeah.
If you ask in the surveys that are done why the youth is reluctant, nervous, anxious, but also less optimistic about, for example, having children, which you see back in the fertility rate, is because they have some sort of, fearful view of the future, which is something that I think we didn't have. We were maybe afraid that in some war, some conflict might accelerate. And that was sort of a distant thing that could happen in the here and now. But you can't not have create an optimistic picture. And quite a lot of what is currently happening is creating a negative picture to make movement. And there is just a miss in a positive articulation of where this world can be. I understand that when you look in the microscope, there's a lot of long list of issues: geopolitics, war, interest rates, debt, and so on. But if you look at the telescope, we will have new energy solutions. We will have productivity doubling from automation. We will have things cleaner than we have now. The advances in science that are currently breaking through in the healthcare side are just amazing. And all of that will just accumulate as it has done in our lifetime.
Yeah.
But that story doesn't exist.
Sure.
And to me, that's where it starts. And actually, Europe on this side is worse than the average. So if you're in India, this is not a discussion. They're saying, we're moving. And we go to the moon and we build our infrastructure.
Absolutely.
And
so it's kind of different kind of imagination and story.
Because before you go like the people should come from another region, the first point is we should have our people optimistic to have, population in Europe. And the fertility rate to me is something that you actually have to think about. Like, we should look at us deep in our pockets and say, why is the fertility rate at this, and solve it. This is not a sustainable fertility rate. And then on top of that, you can then do skill-based migration and all that kind of stuff, which has its political boundaries on how much you can do and what is appropriate and doable and so on.
But the fact is, Sven, you don't have to do it sequentially. It has to happen parallel, surely. You can't wait because Europe has to get bolder, clearly, and tell a different story about its future, which is more hopeful, visionary, and a sense of we can do this. But at the same time, we live in an independent world, and actually we do need foreign talent in Europe. And I suppose my challenge is that you can't wait for one to.
No, you need to. It's a boat, but you can't. They might not come if we don't have a positive story.
Sure. As we kind of wrap up this conversation, I want to kind of ask you to, and I know that McKinsey isn't a political place, it's not doesn't tell politicians what to do, but what's your message? It's early part of the year, like we do each year. So we're having, as I said, our elections this year. There's half the world goes such, but in Europe it matters because we've seen the rise of populism and the far right in a really very, very startling and arresting our attention, because look at what's happened in Germany. We never thought we'd see the scenes that we have in Germany, Italy, and elsewhere. Okay, so there's a real palpable sense that we are shifting to the right. We've got an economic base as you to set out. We need a bolder commission. So my question to you is, what should the next commission do more of or less of?
So if we stay for a moment close by in the nature of European competitiveness, what is currently happening with the two reports that are coming on competitiveness and on the single market, I think is a reflection that there's an input built up on this topic and a deep concern. I actually don't think this concern is only shared by the businesses, it's actually also shared by Europe. Mm-hmm. And on it, I think you would need to, for me, I think what you call bold, but if not every citizen can feel something is moving, it's not a good policy. And everything else is just too detailed. You will have to start seeing large companies emerging because of a change in M&A markets. You have to see energy prices dropping substantially. You will have to start seeing Europe getting access to supply in different ways. You would need to start seeing the incentives for investment go in a way that these investments are actually coming. And to me, if it's not that loud that you can't hear it, but you might call bold, it'll be insufficient.
So we're looking at, so in my words, a more interventionist EU?
Yeah, or the countries in the EU, but they have to understand, the whole system has to understand that competitiveness is basically an Achilles heel for the life that we love. Mm-hmm. And if we don't solve it boldly, and I think you can't say let's do it in 20 years. That's too long.
No.
With a very short timeline, real action will need to be taken.
But you're not saying, I'll come to my final question, you're not saying that it has to be a trade-off between competition and social protection, are you?
No, not really. Certainly not in the current environment with this labor shortage. I don't believe it. I also in general believe sort of in the position that if you automate with AI and other things, that will double productivity and we still need double output. The path to transition is the path to prosperity. The path to clean things up is the path to prosperity. And that is what I fundamentally believe. And that's what all our data suggests. There is no shrink to a great, bright future in this case.
Let's hope the Commission, while as and their policy wonks are listening to what you're saying. My final question, this is to the private sector. What's your message to CEOs? Because, there's been this dance, this kind of dating, merry-go-round, people saying the same thing. The CEOs are saying the same thing for the past 20 years I'm not being critical, and we've been critical of the Commission and public sector. And the message you're giving is, shorter timescale for intervention, be bolder, that's my words, and actually think differently about the relationship between the public and private sector and get it right this time, or try and get it right this time. What's your message to CEOs?
Every individual CEO, but also every individual company needs to make a conscious decision whether they basically follow the flow of returns and are part of the slow ebbing out of the competitiveness of Europe. And for the company, it might mean they still are competitive, just not in Europe. And that is what I would say a passive position versus am I in a position where I do ring the bell, but if nothing happens, it's still them, or whether you become active. And of course, your fiduciary duty as a company to your shareholders can't be that you're an activist in 90% of your time on something that has a 10-year difficult political timeline. Uh-huh. But I think I see every CEO making choices like how much do I weigh into this conversation within the background, the interest and care for the beauty of Europe. Mm-hmm. While at the short term, they will be pushed like no tomorrow to make choices that might actually make the retreat faster. And to me, that is courageous leadership to say, I will weigh in these areas. Not every company will be able to do it in every area.
Sure.
And that courageous leadership, I think, it will also be expected from the private sector as it will be from the public sector.
Thank you. It's a very important and bold message because it kind of tells what we're saying is that we do need a bit of courageous leadership on both sides. But actually, the private, as you say, the activist private sector leader needs to weigh in. We're not saying 90%, but at least 30% would be helpful. At least, even if 10 of them did that, 10 of the largest, imagine we would have the 28-state solution. So thank you very much again for joining Friends of Europe's Critical Thinking Live, and once again, providing such thoughtful insight into what we should be expecting, what the stakes are, and what we need to do to make things better and different. And as we look ahead, I think this idea of a 28th state, you never know. Let's hope it takes hold. And this notion of courageous leadership. Sven, thank you very much for being with us. And we look forward to, again, we won't wait a year to speak to you, but we'll do this again next year. But thank you for your time. And to all our viewers and listeners, thank you for being with us. I hope you found this stimulating and thought-provoking. And, as you're thinking about votes, and if you're thinking about your peer group, take some of these messages out there and see what people think, especially this wonderful new idea of a 28th state for industrial and economic development. Thank you all very much. Take care, look after yourselves, and see you all very, very soon.